Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to your meeting. It's indeed, I think, the third time that I'm coming to your meeting. The first time was in Ghent many years ago as a fairly young researcher. I'm still a fairly young director now of an agency, but as a fairly young researcher. And I also indeed was involved for a while in what the Minarat was doing in Belgium in different capacities. What I will try to do today is talk from the European Environment Agency's perspective about environmental policies in light of the topic that you've been discussing. And of course, I've been through the program and I was here this morning listening, and it's a bit of a challenge to speak when everything has been said already. But I'll try to give my own take on it, because you've had the most eminent people introducing you to resilience and to the European SDG agenda and to many other things. But maybe I have something to add, who knows? Good, very briefly, my 53-second introduction to the agency. The European Environment Agency is a European institution. We work with 39 countries, the 28 of Europe, then Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein and Turkey. We're the only institution of which Turkey is a full member. And we have the 6 West Balkan countries. So we do, in essence, 3 things with those 39 countries. We gather a lot of the environment and climate information. We quality check and assure it, and we report it. We do the reporting to the UNFCCC for Europe, for example, but we report on nearly all of these elements. Secondly, we do what we call our integrated assessments, where we connect things. Transport and mobility patterns, air pollution and health, and we make the connections. And the third thing which we do is, you could say that we do out-of-the-box work. We are sort of a think tank in-house on some issues. So we try to do innovative work that can then feed into the EU policies. You've seen this slide before, so I will be brief on this. If you want to have a good life on this planet, you need to have a high Human Development Index, good education, good healthcare, enough resources to live a decent life. This is within environmental limits. The dots are the countries, the red dots are the EU countries. You can tell how many of us are living well within the limits of the planet, not a single one. But here's where I will add to the previous speakers. The old story that we've been told is this. First, on this planet, we all get rich, and we use too many resources and we pollute. And then all of a sudden, we will start to put pressure on our system, and the system will bring us there. Yeah? It's called the environmental Kuznets curve. In the language, it refers to people like Ron Inglehart, post-materialist values. We have all studied this in school, in the bad schools that we have, we learned already this morning. But there are two problems with this environmental Kuznets curve. The one is a very essential problem, and that is that it doesn't hold for footprint. It holds for pollution. Yeah? You can go through the literature. There is an environmental Kuznets curve for pollution, but not for footprint. Yeah? So the essential theory and applying it from where it originated to this doesn't hold. Yeah? The second problem is that even if it would hold, by the time we've moved 6 or 7 billion additional people from poor to rich, the green space will be gone. Yeah? It will be gone. So even if it would hold, you can't do it. Yeah? So the real challenge is, of course, to do this. That is to make the jump, the transition to this square. And that's also the essence of Paris, for example. We did not agree with China and India that they could follow the same trajectory and then come down. We told them, no, you need to go there. A technology jump, there's a financing mechanism. Also, it's highly complex, but this is the essence, yeah, of what we are looking at now. So business as usual, no longer a viable path. And I think it's also a challenging sort of notion when we think about sustainability, because this is, of course, the notion of sustainability that we all grew up with. You've got the social, the environmental, and the economic, and we've been working on all of that. And you could say that the European welfare state model post-World War II was the integration of the economic and the social to a certain extent. I think today we probably have more than a social crisis than an economic crisis, because the logic is that if you grow this year to next year with 3%, it's a success. But then next year, if you don't grow, it's a failure and you're in a crisis. What do you mean? Was then where we were a year ago not good enough? I mean, there's a strange logic there. And so there is an element of critical reflection that is increasingly entering the debate, whether it's on the beyond GDP thinking or whether it is on what do we define as growth, what do we count as growth. There is quite a bit of critical thinking going on. And then, of course, we've added the environment. And then we've said where they overlap, that's where we draw the arrow and we say sustainable development, and I would say, of course, not. Because essentially, on a limited planet, you cannot have a little bit of sustainability. That's the key message. Yeah? And so the title of the 7th Environment Action Programme of the European institutions is Living Well Within the Limits of the Planet. And so the logic is that the boundary condition for the 21st century will be the ecosystems. And the challenge is that we have to organize our core systems within those limits. And we, in the agency, we have defined 4 core systems that we work on because they tap into the key policies of the EU. It's the energy system, and then the link with ecosystems is clearly the climate and energy approach. We've got the food system. I didn't say the agricultural system, it's the food system, where agriculture is only the production side, yeah? Where we have issues, the mobility system, we've got a decarbonization trajectory for mobility in the EU, and we've got the urban system. We've got the urban agenda, the Amsterdam agenda. Yesterday or last week and this week we had also the Habitat conference with a new agenda there. So organizing this within the limits of the planet is essential. Yeah? And one of the ways I frame it is that these boundary conditions are serious. So the language that we've developed around something like we are using 1.5 planets, we need to step away from that because there is no 0.5 planet. Yeah? It's not there. So we are using the 1 planet, and the 0.5 means that we are degrading and depleting it continuously, which means that we lower the chances every single year, every day, that we will have people living well within the limits of the planet on a global scale. That's the essence of the challenge. Yeah? So that's how we frame things. Now, the vision of the 78P is quite clear. In essence, it says we need to do 3 things. We need to go from low carbon or high carbon to low carbon, from a linear model to a circular model of economy. And thirdly, and that is, I think, too often forgotten, that is, we need to protect and enhance natural capital ecosystems much more essentially, because we keep degrading those. And in essence, that is the basis on which, that's the boundary condition on which we need to build our society. And why do we do it? It's language that is not often mentioned when people discuss the 78P. It's to enhance society's resilience. Resilience, the topic of your meeting, but it's not the resilience of the ecosystems necessarily. It's society's resilience. Yeah? So I think this vision of the 78P has a lot in it. And why do we do it? That's the last sentence. We set the pace for a global, safe and sustainable society. Yeah? The word safe is also in there. And if we reflect on increased understanding of the causes of conflict in society, there are the links. The links are there. By the way, some people in the EU system and also our management board is pushing us now to write something about environmental degradation, conflicts, and migration. Yeah? And I told him I've done a bit of work on that because that's actually the topic of my dissertation 20 years ago. Yeah? And when I wrote it 20 years ago, I was chased out of Leuven University when I came with the proposal because they said, can you not work on something serious? Yeah? So I went to the United States and I worked on something serious. All right, good. The developing policy framework, we frame this in sort of 3 time dimensions. We've got our follow-up of what you could say the acquis communautaire with all our reports, often annual. And those refer to the very concrete goals and objectives of the acquis. And that's where I put 2020. That's where many of these frames land. But increasingly, the new 2020 is 2030. Yeah? Because we're framing the SDG policies there, where you have a climate and energy package there. We've got a circular economy package to 2030. So that's the new 2020. And in terms of investments and setting up infrastructure and research and development, 2020 is over. Huh? I mean, really, 2030 is what we should be thinking of. And then we say on top of that, if you want to do 2030 right, or have a chance of doing it right, yeah, you need to put this in light of 2050. And the most concrete example is the energy system and the climate objectives. You can reach the 2030 climate objectives, minus 40%, by putting all your money, your R&D, your investments in perfecting the carbon-based system. You can. But that's the efficiency paradigm. It has a tangential limit, as we see with the car engine. Yeah? And so if you do that, you create what we call a lock-in. You lock yourself in to the old system, but you can throw a party in 2030 because you've reached your objectives. We say no. The real question is whether you reach your 2030 objectives by opening pathways to 2050. And that may require a very different agenda of R&D, of innovation, of investments. So the same, if we would be just the environmental bookkeepers of Europe, to put it a bit bluntly, we would just report on the tables of whether you have reached your 2030 goals. But I think if you take this long-term transitional agenda serious, as a knowledge institution, we should be able to say more than whether you are reaching your 2030 goals. We should be saying something about in light of your long-term ambitious agenda, which is, by the way, the European translation of a global agenda. So we have a global responsibility there. Huh? That's how we frame things. Now, when I go to resilience and natural capital, this is a key drawing from our State and Outlook of the Environment Report 2015, and it's priority objective 1 of the 70 AP. It's protecting, conserving, and enhancing natural capital. Yeah? And it's not by coincidence that it's priority objective 1. It's the boundary condition. Yeah? It's the egg within which we organize the rest. And what do we see there? I will not go into any details. Every horizontal line is actually a package of policies. And if you would click on every line, you will go into the policies, our reporting on the policies, and all the indicators and all the fundamentals. But we make an assessment here. That's the assessment work. And where we are in the green, you will find words like pollution, quality, because we've been very good there. In 40 years of EU environmental policy making, we have indeed created much better water quality, much better air quality, soil quality, we do our waste better, all of that. And so it shows that if you implement policies within their logic, fighting pollution and creating efficiencies, you have results. So this is good. But where are we in the red? We're in the red where you see words like biodiversity, ecosystems, and climate change, which are the systemic elements. In other words, this is a challenging conclusion because you have had very successful policies, but they have not translated into systemic sustainability and resilience. Yeah? So the challenge is now to make that connection, and we think that's where the transitional paradigm comes in. Yeah? So this is rather essential when you talk about the limits of the planet and resilience. Yeah? Having cleaner water in, I would say, chemical terms does not necessarily mean that you have healthy aquatic ecosystems. That's a bit how we frame it. Yeah? Now, if we look at the 3 objectives, and this is the D table in our SOER, we call it the piano of the European environment. And if you look at the results, we just discussed the first one, protecting and conserving and enhancing natural capital. We're not doing very well at the systemic level, and that is the egg. Where are we better in resource efficiency and in going in Europe to a more low-carbon economy. We're the only place on the planet, the only place where we have established absolute decoupling. The economy since 1990 grew by 50%. We've decoupled by 25%. I'm happy to get the critical questions about have you not externalized all of that. We've looked at that, but I'll take any criticism you have. But in essence, we're the only region on the planet that has taken Kyoto serious. Yeah? Nobody else has, to the same extent. Yeah? So that's where we are in the green. If you look at environmental health, the two red keys there are chemicals, which is a systemic issue. Yeah? The breakthrough of chemicals in nearly everything, yeah? and our knowledge base on them. In Europe, it's ECHA and the Food Safety Authority that are primarily looking at that, and also climate change and impact on health in the long term. So when you look at that and you look into the future, the green disappears. Does that make us eternal pessimists? No, but it means that this planet and globalization means that we are still spreading fundamentally unsustainable systems of production and consumption. If you look at the transport and mobility system, the agriculture and food system, the energy system, they're still fundamentally unsustainable and they're spreading. Yeah? The optimist in me, and I'm more of an optimist, quite frankly, than 3 or 5 years ago, is that I see the tipping points in these systems much more than 3 and 5 years ago. And the red keys and some of the yellows in 20 years could look very differently. If we implement Paris expeditiously and fully, the keys will look different. If we would take the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UNCBD, only half as serious as we would take the UNFCCC, these keys would look different. Yeah? So this is where policies come in, decision-making. And to be quite clear, and it's also in our SOER report, for me, decision-makers are not only politicians. If you're a CEO of a big company, you're also a decision-maker. Yeah? You make decisions on a global production chain, and you set policies. Yeah? And sometimes when you say that to an audience of business people, they look a bit weary at you. And I said, yeah, but look at your own website. You all have a vice president for social corporate responsibility or for sustainability by now. And by the way, you're full of policies. You have your corporate policies. You call it policy. Yeah? So you're a policymaker by definition, yeah? With sometimes much more impact than about 100 of the 200 countries on the planet maybe, because they are much smaller. So policy making for us is a highly integrated concept of governing and steering this transition in a public and private sphere and how they can jointly determine the way forward. Huh? Okay, good. Now, when you think of boundary conditions, resilience, planetary boundaries, we've seen growing global population, yes, up to 10 billion, changing habits, yes, it's not only diets, it's also housing, all of that, the global middle class, the spreading of the better lifestyle as we produce and consume it nowadays. Yeah, so we know that global habitat and biodiversity are predicted to increase, the loss of that, also in Europe, by the way, yeah, also in Europe, this continues. And we also make a link with poverty and inequality. I think that is an essential component. I personally don't think it's credible to believe that we will be able to implement the SDG agenda if Oxfam can keep writing its 199% report, to use that framing language. If we really believe that that is a fertile socio-economic ground to build long-term sustainable development, I think we're wrong. That's a statement that is not directly in our reports. That's my own experience of probably 25 years of research on these issues. Voilà. Now, if we look ahead to our SOER 2020, State and Outlook of the Environment, we are planning this now because we know where we want to land in terms of this integrated understanding. And in Europe, we are framing environment and climate policies increasingly in two economic catch words. Circular economy, the big package from December 2015, low carbon economy, we've had an agenda for a longer time. We're now working on 2030, implementation of Paris, and also the Energy Union agenda. So those two are closely framed. And some people get a little bit upset about that because they say, well, our agenda is now framed purely in economic terms. I'm not so much bothered by that preoccupation. I think you could also look at it very, very positively, which is what I prefer to do. If you frame our agenda on high economic stakes, we're in the room when these things are discussed. And historically, we've been out of the room when economic decisions have been made. So I think this is an advantage if there is a certain openness for it on all sides. Of course, with low carbon economy, we focus on decarbonization, and carbon and the energy system are the key elements. But in circular economy, we talk about resource efficiency and we talk about materials. And that's, of course, where the German Council is referring to the building and construction, highly resource intensive. And by now we know that there is so much embedded carbon in the resource use that we will never be able to reach the low carbon economy if we don't link it more closely to the circular economy. The two are intimately linked to each other. Yeah? And then if you look at land, we just 2 weeks ago had a scientific seminar in Copenhagen on land as a resource. That links it to the circular economy. But we also, of course, know in LULUCF that land has a big role to play in the carbon cycle. So land comes in very big. And by the way, it's a bit strange that we don't manage to get a grip on that, because actually the thing that we always say is the origins of economic thinking on environmental externalities and governance is the tragedy of the commons. And it was about land and land use. So there is a long history in economic thinking about linking land to that type of agenda. And of course we've got water. And we know about water and oceans in the carbon cycle, but also in resource terms. And this is where we usually talk about resilience. That's where I think you got a fantastic introduction, I assume, by the people from the Stockholm Resilience Center. So that I've no doubt that you could not get any better introduction there. But if we then look at the systems in society, carbon is usually linked to the energy system. But we also know that there is an urban agenda there. It was very well introduced this morning, a mobility agenda and a food agenda. And that's where we get well-being. Yeah? So the challenge, I think, and this is in terms of science now, they talk about the nexus issues. It's well developing there. But I think in terms of policies, the real challenge is now to take this nexus understanding and integrate it into policies. Yeah? And that's where I think also I'm more optimistic, because Europe has been framing some of these long-term integrated policy framings in the last couple of years. The circular economy package, the climate and energy package, the decarbonization roadmap for transport, they are linking in a long-term perspective a number of these elements together. So the frames, I think, are more there than they were a couple of years ago. If you look at natural capital then and implementation in the EU system, we look at the nature legislation, which has been mentioned before as well, and which you know very well, of course. Then we've got the pollution agenda. Yeah? We've got a resource efficiency agenda, and we see that there is a growing integration of policies there. Then we've got the greening of sectoral policies and EU programs. And with greening, I refer to a fundamental greening, not to pouring a green sauce on things. Yeah? So if I would be invited to a party that says we are celebrating that the green economy in the last 5 years has grown by 50%, from 4 to 6% of the economy, I would decline the invitation. Because it's not about adding a new pillar to the economy. It's about greening the economy. So I would much rather go to a party where they are celebrating that we can convincingly illustrate that in this and this and this industry, the carbon intensity has dropped significantly, and that the resource productivity and intensity has dropped significantly, and that they are working on nature-based solutions in a convincing way, because that's where I think the way forward is, not in the green sauce or the separate pillar approach. I'm not saying that it has not had any benefits in communication and convincing, but it's not the essential goal, in my opinion. And then, of course, it's about consuming within the limits, and what we now call the nature-based economy. And there the message in one sentence is equally clear from our analysis. It's unrealistic to expect strong solutions based on weak nature. So if you want strong nature-based solutions, you will need strong nature. And that is strengthening and enhancing natural capital, biodiversity, ecosystems. And it's rather clear and convincing from scientific evidence. Yeah. We have our own definition in our environmental indicator report of 12 of resilience. It's the capacity to resist change, or it's an indicator of how much change a system can undergo, or the ability to reorganize after a shock. And that's sort of our framing that we have used. But I say that to illustrate that we've been working on the concept for a bit of time already, based on our fundamental knowledge base. Yeah? Now let's go through a couple of elements. The State of Nature report from 2015, we contributed with this for the regulatory fitness that was done on the nature directives. We contributed with this report, and if you look at where we stand in unfavorable condition, the red and the orange, well, you see where we are with ecosystems. The link with policy here is, of course, that we have set goals for 2020 and 2025. At the current trajectory, we will not reach them. Yeah, that's rather clear. But what is significant is that this is better in places where we have Natura 2000 and protected sites of a larger magnitude, so policies matter, and it's worse in agricultural areas. So the link with the agricultural system and the natural capital is rather clear. Yeah? And in all clarity, this is not an attack on farmers. Yeah? Not at all. It's a factual statement. In fact, I think the real problem of the food and agricultural system is that we've created a system where those who produce the most fundamental thing to us all, food, cannot make a decent living, and we need to subsidize them perpetually to do things that are maybe contradictory with a lot of our other societal policies. But that's a different debate that we can have maybe in a different discussion. Then on forests, well, I don't need to convince this audience that forests provide a range of ecosystem services. But again, they are under pressure, although the hectares in Europe are increasing, yeah, of forest land, under pressure from fragmentation, urban sprawl, climate change, loss of biodiversity, and other factors. Yeah? For example, around Frankfurt in Germany now, there is quite significant a number of hectares of forest that are beyond the tipping point, according to scientists, because of the water tables that have dropped so significantly because of bad spatial planning and bad industrial water use. So these things are interconnected and they are under pressure. Of course, we're dealing with a very disparate system of 14 million forest owners in Europe. So how do you bring governance to that? That's a challenge. And secondly, we in Europe tend to be better in governing forests outside of Europe than in Europe. I think Carl Falkenberg can attest to the fact that forest policies in Europe are hardly existing at the European level. It's like soil. Those are the two big omissions in European policy making. But we have FLEGT, the forest legality system for imported wood. So we set standards in Indonesia and in Cameroon, but we seem to have a bit of a harder time setting them in Europe when it comes to forests. We, of course, have national policies. I'm not saying there is no governance system, but if you want to link at the European level some of these goals, it probably would be wise to have a way forward on soils and forests. So on soils, I know there is a new initiative that is growing now. Okay, so we just came out with a European Forest Ecosystems report. And our conclusion there is that if you want healthier forests that can cope with stress and recover more easily from whatever types of impacts and are able to play their role in a carbon cycle system and in a water system, in an ecosystemic and climate regulatory fashion, we will need to strengthen the resilience dimension in how we manage forests, how we restore degraded forests, and that is almost by definition not by monocropping with one species of trees. That is usually not the smartest thing to do, and also conservation and enhancement and use of biodiversity. And there, of course, there is a link with the financing systems and how you do that. We've been working with the European Landowners Organization, ELO, and I have to say the thinking there is probably much more advanced in some ways than what most people would think it is. Yeah. Then we also looked at the marine environment. These are all dimensions of the global sort of resilience discussion. The marine environment, we don't know much about the marine environment, so there is a big knowledge gap. Priority objective 5 of the 70AP knowledge gaps and how we deal with them. There is a big thing to be done there. We understand better and better the systemic interactions with the climate cycle, but also increasingly the fact that the state of the sea, actually, if you want to understand it, you need to research land. Yeah? Practices on land. Our food, our energy, the waste that ends up there, that's where most of the pressures come from. The overwhelming pressures on the seas and oceans come from land-based activities. So again, there is a close link to these 4 key systems that we are looking at. A small example here is on marine litter. There is this image out there that by 2050, 50% of the mass that you find in the seas will be litter and not biomass. I hope not. That's where policies come in. But this is increasingly a systemic and resilience aspect, because the resilience of species and the interaction of species in the oceanic environment is under serious threat from marine litter. Yeah? If you cut open any fish or seabird nowadays, what you find in the stomach is actually the result of our makeup, our toothpaste, our plastic bags that go into the sea, and all of that. So this is an element of systemic linking and of resilience, unfortunately. If you look at the size of species, there's all sorts of things that you know very well, but we are trying to map some of that in our reports. We brought it all together in the State of European Seas. To use the language of the IPCC, it's very unlikely that we can consider them in a healthy state. In fact, in the Mediterranean environment, we found that 82% of the species is overfished and that there is hardly any balanced, strong ecosystem. It's a bit better in other parts of European seas, and the only reason is that they have a more dynamic connection with the oceans, because the Mediterranean is more of a closed-in basin with a small outlet. We all know where it is. It's in the southern part of this country. So interventions there needed. But we also looked at societal resilience in a number of our reports. We do quite a bit on adaptation in urban environments, and most of the time people relate that to flooding, which is of course important. The city in which I work and live now, Copenhagen, has a sort of lead role in reflecting on these sorts of issues. They've got a very clear long-term integrated policy on climate adaptation. They also have, by the way, the ambition to become the first climate neutral capital in the world. They've got a trajectory on sustainable Copenhagen that is so visible that it attracts thousands of professionals per year that come to Copenhagen to learn about the Copenhagen model. It's really urban branding based on sustainability, which is they have a separate department in the city hall that works with professionals. Yeah. So it's really a specific approach. Of course, heat will also require societal resilience, water scarcity and drought. We know that. In the Mediterranean basin, if you look at the long-term predictions for climate change, yes, you can plant different varieties of wine vineyards, but there is a limit to that. So when are you leaving the safe operating space there? There is an unbelievable slide that links urban temperatures in the summer to deaths in cities, to what is the technical term of people dying? Mortality, yes, mortality. Thanks, Carl. And it's like it's almost a perfect correlation, yeah, in the summer. So it's quite amazing, yeah. Bushfires in some countries. So there's all sorts of things of resilience. And I know this is not societal resilience in the sense of the socio-economic dimension and poverty, although the impacts on the different classes in society is different. And there, by the way, I think the US is ahead of us. They've got a rather strong legislation on environmental justice, on environmental classism and environmental racism. But that's another debate as well. If you look, this is a part of Copenhagen. Systemic challenges require systemic responses when it comes to resilience. Copenhagen in 10 years' time, no, in 5 years' time, had 2 once-in-a-lifetime floods. Yeah. Now, the statisticians amongst you know that this is possible, but highly unlikely. And the cost of that was about 2 billion euros. And that was the tipping point for politicians to say, we really need to do something. And they came up with a plan, a systemic perspective, long-term, integrated and participatory, with profound structural changes in the city. And so they are trying to deal with these challenges now, and they came with a project of climate adaptation in Copenhagen. And it means that the metro system is now being climate-proofed, yeah, through structural changes. It means that if you build a new neighborhood in Copenhagen, and they do that all the time now because it grows by 1,000 people a month, yeah, for 12 years in a row now, that you build the first floor or the ground floor where people live 2.5 to 3 meters above the ultimate spring tide level of today. So there's a lot of thinking and reflecting on that happening. So that's a systemic response. Then, of course, we can look at more regions and provinces. If you look at the Mayors Adapt in this region, you notice that it's well above most other regions in Europe. And in fact, there are parts of Europe where there's hardly any city or municipality that is involved. And this is clearly there is a driver behind that, and it's the political insight and the policy drive behind that. So you can work on resilience also through these mechanisms that exist and that can link cities together and stimulate learning. Because in the end, that's what these networks try to do. They give you tools and they stimulate learning. Yeah? This is an example of Copenhagen and planning. This is when you have a flood in the city, the water can go there, just some images. And of course, then this image I assume you've been introduced to yesterday at length, of the planetary boundaries. So I will not dwell on that. I will now go to what we are doing on planetary boundaries in the agency to conclude the talk and then have ample time for Q&A. A couple of years ago, we in the European system decided to come up with this concept of the environment knowledge community. It was when Carl was the Director General of DG Environment, which is pretty much a collaboration between DG Environment, DG Klima, the JRC, Joint Research Center, Eurostat, RTD, the big research money, Horizon 2020, and the European Environment Agency to form a community that creates, jointly co-creates environmental knowledge. Yeah? And we said we need a couple of breakthroughs where we really need new knowledge. And we called them KIPs, Knowledge Innovation Projects. And we defined 4. One of them is on climate adaptation. How much of a solid knowledge base on climate adaptation do we have in Europe? There is still a lot to be had. So that was one of them. One of them is on the use of long-term sort of forward-looking information systems and scenarios and all of that in Europe. What do we know and how can you bring it closer to policy making, to shape the future? One is on natural capital accounts, integrated natural capital accounts, because we talk about that a lot, but do we have any solid measures? Yeah? We are working with Eurostat primarily on that one. And the 4th one was within the limits of the planet. And the framing there was rather simple. It's the second half of the most important policy document on environment in Europe, living well within the limits of the planet, but how much do we really know about it in Europe? Yeah? So we asked that question, and that's where we are in the lead with the EEA, and we work with the key networks on knowledge in Europe, yeah? With Stockholm, but also with others. We work with some of the key institutions that have done work on that, and we try to come to a number of breakthroughs. Yeah? So what are some of the key questions? And the first stock taking is, what is a safe operating space for Europe? How do we sort of frame that? I wouldn't even say define it, but frame it. Yeah? I'm a bit allergic to endless definitional debates, I have to say, because I don't think they're good for academics, but not always extremely useful when you want to move things forward. And I'll challenge you on that one. If one of you could give me the definition of a dog, I don't think anybody can, but we all recognize one when we see it, right? Whether it's an Irish wolfhound or a poodle, nobody will say, oh, look, an elephant. Yeah? So as long as we know how to frame what it is that we're moving towards, we can start moving. And these are essentially contested concepts. They get meaning by the practices that we develop around them. And so let's move. There is a sense of urgency here. So anyway, okay, good. So do we live within that safe operating space, and what does it mean for European policy? So we did a science policy workshop on this a couple of weeks ago, well attended, highly appreciated, and we are now much better aware of where science is and how policymakers in some countries are dealing with this. Yeah? We also went to some of the countries that have downscaled this concept to a national level, Sweden, Switzerland, South Africa, the UK, to learn from the knowledge that they have created. And we are quantifying some of these planetary boundaries now in very initial steps at a EU scale. I will move on because I'm near the end and I want time to discuss. So what we are trying to do is support the effort, because we cannot do that in the agency. We work with a network of about 300 institutions in Europe and a couple of thousand people. So we are challenging this network now to bring together a knowledge base that sets first steps. Ambitious, but we're not going to be there next year or the year after, but we need to build. So what can we say about this against European policies? Yeah? Do we have a consumption-based approach to this that would link us more to the global scene? Yeah? To a certain extent we have it in some areas, in others we don't. So we are working on that sort of fundamental data, and we look for elements to move things forward. Then, if we look at the policies, what do they mean? What do these boundaries mean? It's clear that the one policy where the boundaries are the driving force is climate. Yeah? The boundary is in the global policy, 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. It translates into a carbon budget. It translates into a European carbon budget. and then we design a trend line and policies under that budget. We distribute it amongst sectors. We have the ETS, the non-ETS. So that's clearly where we downscaled these boundaries and we developed policies. What can we do in other areas? If you think of the phosphorus and nitrogen cycle, yeah, close link to the food and agricultural system, is the next reform of the CAP an opportunity to downscale that global boundary condition to a European policy instrument, actually the strongest policy instrument in financial terms that we have in the EU system? So we're reflecting on what we can do there. And we are also looking at what the integrated SDG framework can mean when we discuss these planetary boundaries. Because I think that is probably the big breakthrough from the MDGs to the SDGs, that it's much more integrated, it's much more global, and it takes these boundaries implicitly, but also here and there explicitly, much more into account. So the sort of conclusion on the MDGs, which was we've put 2 billion people out of extreme poverty, but we should do better on the environment, which was lacking the causal link. We put them out of poverty based on unsustainable systems of production and consumption. So actually the environment is worse off because we use those systems. That is much more integrated in an intellectual and also policy-related exercise in the SDG. So it has high relevance for the type of work that we are trying to do. I will skip this one and come to the end. To make a link with the policy scene, we think that policies in general, and this is rather common knowledge, but we can only re-emphasize it time and time again, need at least 4 qualities when you want to go in this direction. It's one, they need to be integrated. We all know that. But integration beyond sectoral policies. It makes no sense to say that you will invest in 250 buses in your city that are low carbon if your tax system and subsidy system subsidizes for 2 billion euros cars in companies, because the taxes on your salaries are so high that companies take anybody who can read and write and manages 2 people, and they put a company car underneath their derrière, because that's the cheapest way to give them a salary rise. It's not compatible. So this is where things come in, like the finance system, the tax system, but it can be the spatial planning system. So where are the leverages and where are the lock-ins that you really need to understand if you want a truly integrated policy approach? We think that that is rather essential. Then you need a policy approach that has longevity. If you really want to reorganize your energy system within these boundary conditions, not every government can reinvent the energy system. That's where a concept like the Energiewende, and you can have a critical debate about it, but at least there is a long-term vision on where investments and R&D and tax policies and all of these things should go. If every new government thinks that they can reinvent the energy system, it's not going to work. It's like the city of Copenhagen and its long-term planning there. A new mayor will have an extremely hard time to say, well, this is all nonsense. I choose a completely different trajectory. It's nearly impossible. You can put other accents, you can speed up or slow down a bit, but there is a sort of integrated longer-term approach. And I'm not pleading for a purely technocratic approach. I fully recognize that politics, ideology, choices play a huge role, but it's a simple fact that you need longevity there. The third thing is that I think implementation, and this is the sort of most mundane thing, is of course very important. You lose all credibility and you don't move in the right direction if you don't implement. And we know, because we contribute to the implementation knowledge in Europe, that on some of the crucial aspects, we have a rather big implementation gap in some member countries. And so this remains at the European level a very strong emphasis. And the Commission right now, and we are part of the exercise, is looking for implementation and compliance mechanisms that do not necessarily have to lead to infringement procedures. Because infringement is useful as the stick, but how can we think of this in a way that maybe moves things forward in a variety of ways. And then the last thing, and for me that is very critical, is that if the conclusion is that we need fundamental change in these key systems in society, you're not going to get there if this is not a visionary, future-oriented, engaging project. Yeah? So you need that sort of approach. This is not about predicting the future based on models that use the logic of the past, and that's usually what models do, yeah? And you tamper with the logic of the past, because we know that that logic was unsustainable. So we will need to reflect on how we can shape the future more than how we can predict it based on the past. And a very nice example from the energy system is there also that actually none of the big modelers in the world predicted the very fast breakthrough of renewables. Yeah? Because the models on which that was based were following the logic of the traditional energy system. Yeah? The one organization that was best at it, and this is not a promotional exercise, but was actually Greenpeace. Because probably they were less focused on the perfection of the modeling, but more focused on looking for the weak signals, as they call it now in science, the weak signals, the tipping points, the breakthroughs, and how. So we need to reflect on what type of knowledge we want to bring that can support this engaging long-term shaping of society. If we keep working in the environment and climate area from the perspective of, and now we have an agenda which means that you are no longer allowed to do this, and you can no longer do that, and we will tax you for this, and we have 12 new rules on how you, that is probably not a very engaging agenda. Those might be the instruments that we need to dose and mix for an agenda that is engaging. Yeah? And again, I will come back to Copenhagen. The city was broke 15 years ago, broke. Yeah? It had an old population. Now it's growing, it has a young population, it's opening a school every month, yeah? Some sort of school. It's attracting people, it's attracting investment. It's a positive image of how a city can grow. It's an engaging project. People in the city want to be part of this Copenhagen vision of where you are going. Yeah? When I get up in the morning in Copenhagen with the news from Belgium, I follow the news from Belgium, I'm a news junkie, I have to say, and by 6:15 until at least 9 o'clock, you get every single day the endless mentioning of traffic jams. You get a bit depressed. Huh? That is not the vision of the sustainable mobility system that I have in my mind. Huh? So anyway, and then probably, and that's then the self-serving comment, but I think it's a serious comment also for this community, we need to seriously reflect on the knowledge base that we can bring to this. And our reflection is the following. We've built 40 years of environmental knowledge in Europe, and in North America and Japan and a couple of other places. 40 years. It has been incredibly good because it has supported the policies that have been successful. Yeah? Fighting pollution, efficiency gains, we've been very successful. Let's say that we're halfway to 2050. Is the knowledge that we produced in the first half the knowledge that we will need in the second half? We don't think so, although that does not mean that we should not focus on the fundamentals of the environmental knowledge system anymore. We need to measure water and air quality and monitor it, and that's not the point. The point is, what type of new insights and knowledge do we need to bring in support of those who are actually making the decisions, whether it's in the public or the private sector, that will drive these key transitions that will have to keep us within these boundary limits. I think that is an essential challenge for the scientific world, but also for public institutions that are regarded as knowledge institutions or knowledge brokers in the policy system. And I think I'm in an unbelievably privileged position to be working on that sort of project. And I'm sure that many of you are partners and colleagues in this type of work. So we are looking forward to also working with you in the future as part of our network of knowledge building and engaging with policymakers based on that knowledge. Thank you.